Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. He's one of the giants of American politics and political campaigns. He's been a political advisor to presidents, presidential candidates, governors, senators. He's masterminded the most famous of all 20th century elections, the blowout of Ronald Reagan of Walter Mondale in 1984. He is a widely respected and frequently quoted analyst and political commentator, and most recently, he served as the campaign chairman for Republican Mike Huckabee. He's Ed Rollins, and he's here to talk about running a presidential campaign, what it's like, what you need in a candidate, what you need in a campaign, and what you need in a campaign manager, besides luck and money. Welcome back, Ed.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You are an icon. How did you get hooked on politics? What was it that provided you the first fix that made you, 40 years later?
I was a Boston Irish Catholic Democrat, or my family was. I moved to California when I was a young boy. Grew up with my Irish politician grandfather, immigrant, who spent his life in politics. I think it's in your blood. I fell in love with Jack Kennedy in the '56 vice presidential battle, as you may recall. That was against Kefauver, and obviously was very excited in the early days. I was a Kennedy Democrat.
Wow. I in fact, my first experience was in 1960 in a Catholic school where I had the good fortune of taking the Nixon side in the Nixon-Kennedy debate with the Irish nuns, who won that debate.
That was definitely a losing cause.
Yeah, that was definitely a losing cause. You worked for the Big Daddy, Jesser Unruh. What was it like? What did you learn? How did this affect you? And what relevance he had?
Well, he was my first mentor, an extraordinary person who became the speaker. Poor guy who ran for office 3 times, a union guy, a welder, a sheet metal worker. Hitchhiked when he first got elected on the 3rd try, didn't have a penny. Ends up in Sacramento, and 6 years later he's a speaker and creates the California legislature into a full-time, probably the most powerful, most effective in the country. He was an extraordinarily bright guy, but he understood people. He used to say every man has a price. He said some it's women, some it's money, some it's booze. Sometimes they take your women, take your money, drink your booze, and they still vote against you. And he said those you can't buy, you rent for a while. And he said, as a young man, he said to me, you're going to have to decide whether you're going to be for sale or you're going to be for rent.
And you decided for rent.
And I said, what if I don't want to be any of those? He said, then you have no weaknesses, and every man has a weakness. So,
as a political operative, do you have a weakness?
Yeah, I fell in love with candidates. That's my weakness.
Think you fell in love with Mike Huckabee, and we'll have to talk about that.
He's a great candidate. I did.
How did you become so you're a Kennedy Democrat. How did you become a Republican?
I went off and I taught for a couple of years during the '69 through '72 period. Ended up being
a political scientist.
Political scientist at Washington University in St. Louis. Kids were burning down the campuses over the war and what have you.
I was one of those kids, not burning.
I had gone through the emotional trauma of I was Bobby Kennedy's student coordinator in Northern California, and in '68 I had lunch with him the week before he was assassinated. So went through that trauma. Unruh being the state chairman, and I went off. I decided politics maybe I was too emotionally involved and certainly too painful. I watched the kids who burnt down the campuses and the professors who were tearing the campuses apart go off and nominate George McGovern.
And you were an administrator as well.
I was an administrator, and obviously the sort of the point person out there every day fighting the hordes, as I used to call them. And I just decided the Democratic Party. My father was a shipyard worker, built atomic submarines with nuclear weapons on them. Once again, a staunch Democrat. Went home, got in a big fight with him. I said, I think I'm going to go run Nixon's campaign in California. And he said, I can't believe you would do this. He said, I voted for Nixon. We first came here in 1948 against Helena Hagen Douglas. He lied. He lied then, he'll lie again. And it was the only fight my dad and I ever had that was serious. And so I became a Republican. I always say in 1960, the first president I supported was Kennedy, who was for strong national defense and cutting taxes. 20 years later, I was in the Oval Office as the White House political director for Ronald Reagan, who was for strong national defense, cutting taxes. So I think it tells you more about the movement of the Democratic Party or the country than it was about purely my.
What role did you play in the 1980 Reagan win?
I was the chief of staff in the Assembly in California. So I did a lot of the stuff in California. I was I was very close to Len Nofziger, who was the press secretary. I did the communications work at the convention, what have you. But I mainly handled California, a lot of the West.
How did you become the mastermind, the campaign manager in the '84 campaign?
You know, I did. The interesting thing is probably the best training for running a presidential campaign was running 80 assembly races. You sit in an office, you look at a lot of data, you talk to people all day long, and I had done that for the California Assembly, and
you had to know each individual district in some
consultants, right. And in addition to being the Republican chief of staff, I worked on a daily basis with policy. I like policy. I'm more of a policy guy than I am a campaign guy. But the way it worked in those days is you'd go off. You get your guy elected every 2 years, and then you'd have to go off staff and go get him reelected in order to do the governing.
Right.
And the great thing about UNRU is UNRU and the Democrats sort of believed that staff were unelected members, and oftentimes they would take, with reapportionment, they would say, all right, you're going to become Vic Fazio, the great Democrat leader in the House, was one of my colleagues on UNRU's staff, and UNRU says, I'm going to carve out
cherry pick the districts and
send the staff out who
win.
Who win. He controlled the money, controlled the resources. The great thing he taught me, all the changes that have occurred in politics, and as I've said to you, everything I know about politics is different in this cycle. But the one thing he taught me, which is a critical lesson, he said, you find your voters, you communicate with your voters, and you get them to the polls. If you're doing anything other than those three things, you're wasting your time. Now, there's lots of ways of finding voters that you couldn't before, lots of ways of communicating, internet, all the rest of it, and lots of ways of getting them to the polls.
But it's simple.
The fundamentals are all the same. And if you keep your eye on the ball, and every time these are the functions that need to be done, these three overarching functions, and that's what he taught me.
What was Reagan like as a candidate in '84, and then you ran against Mondale, and we've talked about.
He was an extraordinary candidate for two reasons. One is he always knew what his role was. He had a near photographic memory, which is a part of Reagan that a lot of people didn't know. He loved people. He loved to campaign, and so that part of the game he really enjoyed. Some people don't like him. George Bush Sr. never liked campaigning. He was a terrible campaigner. You could see it. Ronald Reagan loved to perform. He loved to get out there with the audiences. And as a matter of fact, we decided in the White House that he needed a day or two a week out of the Oval Office to get revved up. If all he had all week long was he was going to meet with foreign leaders, what have you.
Right.
But we'd always say, all right, Wednesday we're going to go out. We're going to go to Ohio. We tried to do day trips. We'd go out and spend the day.
Give him some juice.
And he'd get juiced. And so he was an extraordinary candidate. Equally as important, because of all his years in the movie business, he was used to taking direction. And so my job as campaign manager was not to sit there and argue as people did with Clinton or what have you. I'd say, Mr. President, here's where we think you ought to go. Here's the message. He'd certainly help a lot of it. And then his job was to go out and basically perform very effectively.
Talk about the team, because campaigns aren't single individual managers or consultants or candidates. They're a team. What was that team like?
I handpicked the team, and it was a combination of some of the old Reaganites, which is always very important to have, and some new talent. And by '84, there were a lot of people who hadn't been Reagan supporters in either '76 or '80 who were major players. They were governors, they were what have you. So they wanted to be a part of the team. The key thing in it is it's not a committee. You can't run it by a committee, and yet you can't be a dictator. You've got to make sure everybody has very clear lines of authority, and you've got to make sure that there's not the argument and dissension. Everybody gets to have their voice heard. But I made the decisions.
Okay.
And I had been the White House political director, so I came right out of the White House. Lee Atwater had been my deputy, who came out with me as the deputy campaign manager. And we structured the campaign from 4 or 5 people to where we had thousands by the end. But the great lesson that Richard Nixon told me when I was putting this together, he said, every single day you have to give something up. And I said, what do you mean by that, Mr. President? He said, Well, when you go over and you start a campaign, you're the guy. You pick the bumper strips, you put people in offices, you pick people here. And at the end of the day, you've got to step back and have a big picture. And he said there's three kinds of generals. There's the general that sits in the Pentagon and tries to run the war 10,000 miles away. There's the Patton who wants to be in the front tank, and all of his troops are worried about him getting shot or what have you, but he at least knows what the battle is. But the most important kind of general is the guy who's above the fray in a helicopter. He says, so always think of yourself in a helicopter above the battle. You're close enough to where you can watch it, you can make the decisions, but you're making them from above, not in the midst of it. And that was a wonderful lesson to me. Often I actually had a little helicopter in my office that I thought about all the time. But the key thing is to I was always a big picture guy. I've never seen a tree in my life. I always look at the forest. Lee Atwater was a great guy looking at the branches and what have you. So the key
nice complementary set of skills and orientations.
We worked very well together. As we actually were better together than we ever were apart. But at the end of the day, it's a question of you've got to have the authority, you've got to make decisions, and even more so today because everything is instant.
Okay, you are a political general consultant, and then you're a campaign manager, and then you are the campaign director. Do these terms, are they synonymous? What are the chief strategist? What are all these terms?
The truth of the matter is, whether I'm the campaign manager or I'm the strategist or what have you, when a campaign works well for me, I'm in charge.
Okay.
I pick my team. I may have someone who's the day-to-day manager who worries about all the minutia. If I just come in and I'm just a one day a week type person, I can help a little bit, but it's not the same. I need to have my arms around it, put a team together. The problem is there aren't many general consultants anymore. The world of politics has now become, outside of presidential politics, I used to be hired by a candidate. I, in turn, would hire the pollster, the media person, the mail guy, what have you, press secretary, campaign manager. They all report to me.
Right.
And the candidate would basically be a person who talked to me first thing in the morning, last thing at night.
Right.
Now, usually the person that's hired now is a pollster. And the pollsters have all filled the role as strategist.
Right.
And the idiocy of this, and I believe in pollsters, have many friends who are, but they can't get off the paper. It's not on the numbers. They can't deal with it. It's not about a gut. It's not about...
well, I mean, that charge has been leveled against Mark Penn.
Right, and many others. I mean,
right,
I think the reality is when the pollsters... But the pollsters have the most data, so they obviously go into a candidate and they argue this or that.
Right.
And they'll say to you, okay, you want to run for something, you got 10% name ID, we need to do this, this, this. The media guy hops in and he says, hey, let's go, let's get on TV, I can raise those numbers. And what you need is someone like me to say, hey, wait a minute, no one's paying attention. Why should we go spend millions of dollars now on advertising when no one's paying attention? Just because the pollster says you have no name ID, let's lay out a plan of when we need to raise our name ID, when we need to do mail, do this. And so I think part of the reason why these campaigns cost so enormous sums of money is they start them way too soon.
Okay, and they've been progressively earlier, and then the campaign season has been progressively earlier.
Absolutely, and everybody has a vested interest because that's how they make their money,
right?
Is by doing media.
And then the media buy people really have vested interest. What do they make? 15%?
Absolutely. You can make $3 or $4 million in a presidential campaign doing the media, what have you.
Okay, before we get to your latest presidential candidate, Mike Huckabee, let's very briefly talk about Ross Perot. That relationship wasn't the relationship you had with Huckabee nor with Reagan.
The mistake I made is Perot was a salesman. He was in a real selling mode when he wanted me to come run his campaign. He promised everything in the world, and I was fascinated by it. I assumed it was going to be my last campaign because I was going off to run an independence campaign. I knew Washington would turn on me, which they did. But I thought it was a very important thing to change American politics for the good. Perot, once he became a front runner, which was about the same time Hamilton Jordan.
It was like in that June he was leading the polls.
He was actually leading in the polls after the California primary.
Right.
He was leading in the polls. Bush probably would have ended up third. I knew Bush had 60% disapproval rating, and he was not going to get reelected. That's one of the reasons I went. And Clinton obviously was an untested, and everything people knew about him was not necessarily positive. So there was this tremendous opportunity, but he didn't want to run. He kept saying, I'm not going to run a conventional campaign. And I keep saying, Ross, a conventional campaign is you go out and you communicate with voters. Going back to the
Rule one.
Find your voters, communicate with your voters. but he was getting scrutinized as anybody normally would in the early stages of a campaign. And he didn't like it.
Right.
He didn't
and
like.
He flipped out.
He flipped
with the
out
helicopters over the daughter's wedding.
All bizarre stories. And he was a guy who lived in a cocoon. He was, as I said, he was a great salesman, but he ran a company that never had PR, never had advertising, and the rest of it. So even though he had agreed to enormous sums of money to spend, he pulled out a little checkbook like everybody else does when they go to the grocery store, and you want $5 million or $10 million that have been approved in the budget for television. You say, no way, I'm not going to do this.
Oh,
and so it was 6 weeks of he was in terror, and I had put a very first-rate staff together, and we just couldn't move the ball forward.
Okay, so now we move 16 years later or 15 years later, and we're in December of 2007, and you apply for the Mike Huckabee job?
I met Mike Huckabee. He was the only candidate I didn't know well. I knew who he was from being the governor of Arkansas, but I knew everybody else. I knew the cast of characters for a long, long time. And but he intrigued me. And when I first met him at a cocktail party here in New York, he asked for a few minutes to talk to me, and I said, I wish you well. Like everybody else, this is, and he was probably at 0 or 1% on the polls, and I said, wish you well.
Right.
I walked out and I said to my wife, most impressive speaker I've ever heard since Reagan, hasn't got a snowball's chance in hell of being a viable candidate.
So he impressed you that much on the first. What was it?
It was a little book party that Georgette Mossbacher had for him.
What was it
He connected with the audience, and he had this extraordinary, cocktail party. He stands in front of a cocktail party. Nobody knew who he was, and he basically could hear a pin drop. So then I watched him in the debates. It was the last thing I was going to do I was going to do TV commentary. I was not going to do another campaign. And I basically just watched him. Thought, this is a campaign I can help. This is a campaign who didn't have 50 strategists or all the rest of the Washingtonians that are there. And so I sent him a little email, and I said, and I had been communicating. I met him in a couple of events along the way. And I said, if you want my help, I'd be more than willing to do it part-time, full-time, whatever. Instantaneously sent me an email back saying, you're signed on right now. And so we sort of worked out.
When did you first meet him as the campaign manager, and what did you talk about?
We sat down, and I went down and I met the campaign managers.
And this is in December?
This is early December.
Okay.
I went down, very small campaign. I mean, first of all,
right.
There's like 25, 30 people. The national political director is his daughter. She's 25 years old. She's fabulous, but she's 25 years old. Her whole experience had been her dad's gubernatorial races. Chip Salzman was the day-to-day manager, had run the PAC for Bill Frist, a guy out of Tennessee, a fabulous guy.
But again, not a national player.
Not a national player. And actually, there was no one in the campaign who had ever been in a presidential campaign. But they were great, enthusiastic kids. And so the great part for me, and I basically climbed on the plane and flew with him every day. I was his chief strategist. And we had a magical relationship. He was an extraordinary communicator, but more important, an extraordinary man. He gets up at 4 o'clock in the morning, gets on the internet, spends a couple of hours, writes everything himself. These are his thoughts. There's no speech writers. This was a campaign without a poll, without a fundraiser, very little media. And the theory that I'd always had that I wanted to test, and this gave me a chance to test it, is I was always convinced in a presidential campaign, like a New York mayor's race, paid television isn't necessary if you can get the free media.
Yep. And you guys were masterful.
We were masterful at it. We obviously didn't have the resources to be on paid television, outspent 10, 12 to 1 by Romney and others. But he was a great communicator on television.
But you predicted early, and you delivered on the prediction that you were going to win Iowa. I remember reading in mid-December, you predicted that you were going to win Iowa. How did you know you were going to win Iowa? How did you pull off winning in Iowa? And that gave you what? A couple of $100 million worth of earned media?
Absolutely. From the time December 15th to about January 15th, I think we had about 340 interviews on television. He was on television 15, 20 times a day. And we built everything around his team. We went on and did gigantic rallies, and we did all kinds of things like that. But we didn't have the paid advertising to back it up. So everything we did was to try and create free media, whether it was his Christmas ad or his Christian leader ad or any of the rest of it.
The famous Christmas ad with the cross in the background, which was perceived to be.
Perceived to be, right. But our ads created an excitement. But the most important part of it is he wrote his own ads. He starred in his own ads. He's a guy, the only guy I've ever seen who could do this was Reagan. You could shoot Reagan in 2 shots. I mean, just bam, bam. Read it, shoot it. This guy was the same way. Walk in, boom.
Talk about message and constituencies. Who did he appeal to? Who did he turn on?
His constituency, obviously, was, particularly in Iowa, was the Christian right.
Right, and he played that straight out.
He played that straight out, and was a very significant factor in Iowa. He had a very broad-based, obviously, having been governor in Arkansas, a governor who won 45% of the African American vote. I mean, just in a state that's 80% Democrat.
Right.
He has a great ability to communicate, and he had a great record. The problem was in the primary, he did things as a governor. He fixed the schools. He took the schools from 48th to 8th in the country. Spent money, fixed schools. He spent money to fix roads. He was a compassionate conservative. Before the compassionate conservative got a bad name by the president. I mean, he believed his job as governor was to fix things.
So there was an element of social theology here in Huckabee, as well as the more traditional look at religion that we normally look at. In many ways, I've told you this, he reminded me of John Edwards in terms of his concern with the people and the working class blue collar folks. Even though I disagreed, ideologically and a lot of his religious views, there was this real strain of populism there.
He is a populist. I mean, first of all, these guys never made more than $65,000 a year as governor. I mean, he was a minister. He ran a very significant church in Arkansas before, but 13 years of public life. You don't acquire a lot of money. His father was a fireman, mechanic, who basically lived in a rented house and really in Hope. So he'd been around people who were poor all of his life, and he understood the working poor, the people who didn't want welfare, the people who basically wanted a job, wanted things created, and so he could go out there and talk about them. The ideological part of it, meaning the religious part of it, was something that was at his core. And he could explain his positions better than anybody you've ever heard. He could go in a church and give a sermon that was totally different than the politics, and he would separate that at all times. But it was an inspirational, uplifting. He is the best speaker, and I traveled everywhere with Ronald Reagan for a long period of time. He's every bit in the league of Ronald Reagan, and there's never been another Republican like that. And even more important, he's like a younger Ronald Reagan in the sense that Reagan got a little too scripted when he was president. This guy needed no script. But at the same time, you could walk in his room at night, 11 o'clock, and he'd be there in his boxer shorts, ironing his own shirt to be ready for the next day, a shirt and a suit.
You loved it.
And I'd say to him, Governor, there's a little plastic bag there in the corner, in the closet. You can put your stuff in there. He said, I can never do that. He'd do his own laundry, do his own thing. But more important than any of it, I've never seen anybody connect to people.
That's what I was going to go to. Give us a sense of the connection, the almost charismatic connection there.
He cares about people, and they sense it. He has a great sense of humor. He has great stories. I sat and listened to every speech. I mean, one of the things that I always found it's very important is you listen to every word, and especially when you have someone who basically doesn't go off a script. They may have the script in their head, but they ad lib, and that's the kind of speaker that he is. So I sat every day, 7, 8, 9 times a day, and listened to every word they ever made. So I heard the same speech 100, 200 times. Every time he could capture that audience, he could motivate, he'd move the parts around depending on the audience, but just an extraordinary communicator. But people sensed in him a real guy, and even my friends in New York who don't agree with him on any of the ideological stuff say to me, I really liked your guy. Your guy was a really good guy. And at the end of the day, that's a very important quality. Relative to his religious beliefs, I mean, one of the things that hurt him initially was the religious right in our party is a very significant force. The leadership of the religious right has now become very politicized, and they want to be part of the winning team.
And they're the power players.
And they're the power players. Well, they thought they were the power players. They thought they were the power players. And they wanted to endorse someone that they thought could win. They didn't want John McCain. So who can win? Who can beat him? So a lot of them jumped around. A lot of them got bought off. But what we discovered is that there are gigantic churches across this country with pastors and people in the pews that don't care what these religious leaders say, that they care about who you are and what you are, and do you understand my kids? and we went right around them. We went right around the religious leaders. We went to the churches. We went every Sunday. He preached 2 or 3 times. We basically we went out and talked about their issues. He never faltered from the issues, even to the point when there were points that people argued with him that you need to broaden the base, broaden the message, which he did. But at the same time, he always stayed at the core of his beliefs.
You've said that stepping outside your relationship with Huckabee, he would make a good vice presidential candidate for McCain, even though you don't think it had happened. Right. Why?
First, he's a tremendous communicator, and so he can go out and make the case against whoever whether it's Obama or Hillary. He knows Hillary better than anybody, obviously, even been the governor of Arkansas, following the Clintons. He can give imitations of both Clintons and certainly knows their record better than anybody in a very humorous way. He would be a tremendous asset if she's the nominee. Equally as important, he has that uplifting spirit, the same as Obama. If he becomes if Obama became the nominee. He could put the line. He knows a lot of substance. He's chairman of the National Governors Association. You get 3 U.S. senators. You need someone who understands what's going on in the states. So I think he'd be a tremendous asset.
Downside.
Well, the downside, I think, is that he obviously is a regional candidate. He's a Southern candidate, which is very important. I think that there's a lot of misinterpretations about his spirituality, and is he going to
is he going to separate
which he always did
from the state,
as he always did as governor, and I think to a certain extent there's nothing in the platform of the Republican Party, which has been in the platform for a very long period of time, that he doesn't advocate, and there's nothing in there that basically is so controversial that someone want to alter it. I think he just fills in a big gap for McCain. Plus, there's a great chemistry between the two of them.
Two quick answers to 2 quick questions. If he's not VP, future for Mike Huckabee?
I think he'll go out and do everything he can to help McCain get elected. McCain gets elected, then obviously he does not want a cabinet post. He will go out and go into broadcasting in some way, shape, or form. He's going to write a book. He comes out of a broadcasting background, which is part of the great strength.
Last question. Any candidate out there that might cause you to rip up your latest political self-obituary? Is there anybody out there you'd work for? Send that email to.
I got spoiled by the Huckabee. This was the most.
This is the real final Ed Rollins campaign?
Well, I hope there's another Huckabee campaign, but this was great fun. There was not one day of dissension ever. And that's you can imagine what a campaign is like.
That's
so
heaven.
There were
not to use a religious.
No, there were three people who made the decisions. Chip Saltzman was the campaign manager. Me and the governor. We were never at odds with each other. He shared everything the governor did, his thought process. It was just one of these, a pleasure to get up every day and be with.
Oh, nice.
To be a nice way to quit.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. And with very little money, we came in second, and I think we were 5th of the fundraising on our side.
Yep.
So
remarkable job. Congratulations.
Thank you. Great candidate.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.